And welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on the 5th day of the Solidarity in Diversity Conference, and the organisers have done a fantastic job putting the conference together in the midst of another lockdown. So well done to the team. I hope you've all been keeping well and enjoying the conference so far. So my name's, as JP said, my name's Stefan Shepherd. I'm an associate professor at Swinburne University, and I'll be chairing this session featuring Abiola Ajetomobi, which I'm very much looking forward to. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, wherever we're situated today. In my case, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here with us today. And I want to welcome all members of the African Australian community here with us as well. So for the format, we'll have our keynote speaker present, then we'll have our discussant, Franca Vaughan, who's the convener of the African Studies Group at Melbourne University, and she'll share her thoughts on the presentation. Following that, I'll ask Abiola a few questions myself, and then we'll throw to the audience for Q&A. So we will be taking questions in the Q&A box, so feel free to enter your questions there anytime during the presentation, and we'll address them to the speaker at the conclusion of the presentation. And you'll also have the opportunity to directly address your question to Abiola if you use the raise hand function. Now to our speaker, Abiola Ajetomobi is the director of the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre Innovation Hub. She is a social innovator who is passionate about forming creative and sustainable solutions to increase people's economic and social participation that would otherwise be left behind in society. Abiola works to ensure that those seeking asylum in Australia have the level of agency required to reach self-actualisation and independence. Her professional background is very impressive. It spans across humanitarian organisations, various businesses, the accounting and financial services, social entrepreneurship, not-for-profit, and the public service. Abiola's won several awards, including the In the Future Leader Award at the International Women's Day Awards in Melbourne in 2015. And she was also the inaugural winner of the Entrepreneurship, Leadership and Innovation Alumni Award at ACU in 2020. Abiola also serves on a number of significant boards where she contributes to the advancement of women, girls, and the unification of the African community in Australia. So that's quite a resume. And the title of her presentation is The Role of Allyship and Advocacy in Amplifying Marginal Voices. So can we all give a warm online welcome to our keynote speaker, Abiola Ajetomobi. Welcome, Abiola.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Franca. Thank you to the African Studies Group for this wonderful opportunity. I don't take it for granted at all. Today, I would like to begin also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I am meeting and that we all are meeting today, and pay my due respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. Also acknowledging that the land I'm on, unfortunately, has never been ceded, but I always like to finish my acknowledgement by paying my deep respect and gratitude to the First Nation people for the sense of welcome and embrace that I've felt from their community since I've called Australia home. So today I'll be speaking on the role of allyship and advocacy in amplifying marginal voices. In recent times, we have seen the world grappled with the impact of multiple crises: the global pandemic, the ripple effects of Black Lives Matter movement, the climate change, the growing inequality in a global scale, particularly in the last 18 months, the challenging times and uncertain times that we've all experienced. In the midst of all of this, there has been civic unrest, economic crisis, social isolation, increased mental health crisis, unprecedented family separation and violence, displacement, many people losing homes, shelter, and many more. No one, I believe, has been spared from the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. But I'm deeply touched by the recent crisis in South Africa, Myanmar, and other countries that have been facing political, social, and climate war. I believe that in this dilemma that we found ourselves as humans in this world, and that humanity in the midst of all of this has been threatened. Children, vulnerable communities, minorities, refugees, orphans, people living with disability, elderly, poor, underprivileged, underemployed, all needing world leaders, political leaders, activists, advocates, academia, community leaders to shine a light on their issues and be the voice for change for them. As we grapple with the impacts of COVID-19, many of us has relied on social media as a sole medium of communication. Some of us have hundreds, if not thousands of friends on the platform, on individual platforms that we're on, but the sense of emptiness and loneliness increased significantly through this time, making it obvious that we all need each other and that human connection is greater now than ever before. Black Lives Matter is one that has really had a profound impact on my life and my journey as someone that's come to Australia to seek asylum, a refugee, a woman of color, and all the other labels that you could think of. But it's also exposed the deep racism and inequalities in our society, bringing us to an urgent moment of self-examination and reckoning. The world became so small, in my view, since COVID-19 started, and the reality of being our brothers and sisters keeper became more real and required from us all. I've observed political leaders in how they dealt with this crisis. Most of them seemed so confused. I could even only liken it to my daughters standing in front of the pantry or opening the fridge, wondering what to eat. From the context of Africa, given that we're talking today from the platform of the African Studies Group at the Melbourne University, I'd like to reflect on the impact of colonialism on Africa. Africa as a continent has faced the effects of colonialism and climate change. A continent with the world's best minerals, resources, deep sense of identity and cultural heritage, yet the history of slavery, deprivation of wisdom, of freedom, entrenching society identities turned the communities against itself. Africa has endured that long history of oppression, suppression, determination to be free, and also to be able to regain their self-esteem, dignity, and a sense of actualization. At the release of many nations from Africa through independence, which they tirelessly fought for, the psychological welfare of white saviorism, paternalistic relationship of Western world still kept that colonial mindset very much in the midst. The very sense that you are free, but would forever rely on us for help, for sustainability, for better health, for good governance, became the social contract between Africa and the rest of the world. Westerners, I believe, kept their part of the social contract by always coming to our rescue and kept us wondering, when does the true freedom and liberty actually begin? In all of this, the awareness of centering voices of Africans in determining the future of their continent became really prevalent and important. Bringing this back to Australia and the context of the rest of the world, I would say the same applies. In all sectors, forums, platforms, political landscape, I believe we can all agree that regardless of gender, race, or sexuality, we all need to see the world differently and take necessary actions today that will give us an equal and equitable future. But there's still the big question of how. That's because the gender gap, race, inequality, power, control, institutional racism, disparity the questions all remain unsolved. Many organizations and institutions' legitimacy and social license are threatened unless they make drastic shifts in their organizational practice. By increasing diverse representation and uprooting the practices that reinforces colonization mentalities and give power and choice to the community they exist for. Researchers and academias are often finding themselves unconsciously focusing on topics that reinforces marginalization rather than the holistic view of individuals. Marginalized communities, on the other hand, not that they don't have a voice, but often they feel reluctant to hold the community to account, reluctant to ask the right questions, reluctant to address structural barriers themselves because of the fear of possible backlash, being labeled as being ungrateful, or even finding themselves in situations that gave them a very costly act because they have spoken up and it became gaslighted. And also in that means the perpetrators of this act are often not even aware of what they're doing or how they can fix it. When we reflect on all of these scenarios, we can see why the role of allies and advocates are more important than ever before in amplifying marginalized voices. Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Social Violence, in their working definition of allyship and doubt, described allies and advocates as an active, consistent, odious practice of unlearning and reevaluating, in which a person holding systemic power seeks to end oppression in solidarity with the group who has systematically disempowered. I've reflected severally on this definition, and especially in the context of my lecture today, and I can see few words jumped at me as I reflected, mainly on learning, re-evaluating, solidarity, and systemic disempowerment. To unlearn and to re-evaluate when amplifying marginalized voices, we must be self-aware. We must maintain curiosity, must ask questions, and be willing to share our spaces, our power, and our privilege with those at the center of the social impact we are trying to achieve. Allies and advocates must ensure that their actions and inactions provide opportunities the communities they represent need to thrive, and to speak and to be heard, and to maximize their potentials. When dealing with systemic disempowerment, many individuals, institutions, people in power, organizations, allies, advocates often get trapped in their own privileged lens. This unintentionally reinforces the very structural issues they are trying to fight, and leading to a dilemma called empower to disempower. Most organizations understand the philosophy of human-centered, right-based approach, but often lack the understanding or the preparedness of the ripple effects that the moment of change and transformation bring. My message today is that we can choose to be advocates and allies, and we can choose to represent communities and amplify their voices. And also we can choose to address the structural barriers in our workplace settings, in our community, in public forum, in corporate offices, in government parastatals, in our environment, and everywhere we find ourselves and we can sense injustice. It is an humanly thing to do. But when you step up to empower and challenge those that make the change, to act and you amplify the voices of others, you become a source of inspiration to others and a catalyst for the change to occur. But please, as allies and advocates, in the midst of doing so, be intentional about what you're advocating for. Keep checking in with your why, so you're not caught up in your own self-gratification and narrow views. Always remember that you as advocates, it's not a position, it's a responsibility that comes with great sacrifice. To break this down into the question of how, the role we can play as allies and advocates in amplifying marginalized voices, the few examples I'd like to give is, from the context of world leaders, is about putting humanity first before economic recovery. It's about paying attention to communities that may be left behind whenever policies are made, and invest in adequate resources to genuinely seek the input of this community to ensure inclusion and access. It's about not-for-profit organizations putting participants at the center of managing and leading their organizations. Participants are not only simply intended to be beneficiaries of programs. They are also the programs that they have gained, but they are also there to provide their program experience in order to guide the organization moving forward to achieve social impact. Organizations motivated to make a difference for participants is not the same as placing participants at the center of managing and leading change. This distinction is critical because placing participants at the center requires rethinking how they are affected by the management's decisions and not simply by the social change strategies adopted on a program level. Organizations that are intentional go beyond having a statement on strategic plan to investing in resources, training, and assisting staff and their community to recognize their biases, undergo diversity audits, and create a plan and strategy that's intentional and genuinely leading to the change they want to see, tying it to their leaders' KPIs. It's also, another example also, is staff, volunteers, decision makers, all understanding the intersection drivers of marginalization and exclusion, the exacerbating factors, and the barriers to inclusion. Another example is around delivering trainings on how to analyze the needs and rights of inclusion in the context-specific ways, right to developing initiatives that build capacities of specific rights holders to understand how to advocate for their own rights. Another way we could see this example of what it looks like when the voices of marginalized communities are amplified is by investing in resources and information relating to marginalization and exclusion, promoting resources publicly so external stakeholders such as lawmakers, funders, grantors, community members and leaders, allies, advocates are re-educated on what it means to truly amplify voices and empower communities to respond to their own needs. For those listening to me today and wondering, where do I start? What point do I start to becoming an ally? My response is, get familiar with the issues affecting minority groups, not letting your assumptions and mental models frame your perception and conclusion. Make sure your position is always to stand beside and not in front of. The role you play as allies must not rob people of their empowerment, rather, whether unintentionally or intentionally. Always make sure you do the nuance, that things you would learn in the process are unfamiliar to you and totally different to your well-meaning understanding. Seek deeper understanding that can drive cultural shifts. As allies and advocates, we must be prepared to make mistakes because we will. Humility in this context is always the key asset. We must, like a quote that I saw recently, be humble enough to accept our mistake, intelligent enough to learn from it. You must be at peace as allies and advocates with the fact that the group you are representing is not obligated to like you, thank you, feel sorry for you, or forgive you. Your feelings do matter, don't get me wrong, but this is not the space to get your feelings validated. As I bring this lecture to a close, I'd like to end by these few notes. Envisioning equity, equality, and true justice, whether in Africa, Australia, or the rest of the world, demands a shift in system thinking and intentional adjustment to our behaviors. Demands us to take responsibility for actions and inactions. Demands us to always be able to acknowledge when we do wrong, and also to ensure that we are making genuine effort to distribute and redistribute power. The future is unequal if the voices at decision-making tables aren't diverse and also aren't representative of the communities at the heart of the issue. Harnessing the power of allyship and advocacy, however, for change strengthens diversity and social inclusion to counter racism or alleviate social justice. So it's a job that must be done. But in doing so, let us respect lived experience voices and recognize that the experts on any form of oppression are the people most directly affected by it. And their analysis of the oppression should always take precedence over any opinions of people or any experiences they thought could occur. Like I often say, one of the best ways allies and advocates can make a meaningful contribution to social change policies is by first, policies to amplify voices is to first take those magnifying glasses and turn it to themselves first. Travel inward, check your why. Regularly keep yourself in check with the communities you are advocating for. Lastly, amplified voices of marginalized communities won't happen overnight. It requires time, intentional investment, maintaining curiosity, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, and not being afraid to challenge and be challenged. And like I said in my earlier notes, remain humble and never take the front seat of the very community you are representing. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Abiola. Can we offer an online round of applause? It was fascinating and a lot of interesting insights, especially grappling with some of the key challenges facing marginalized voices, and some sage advice on how to meaningfully overcome these challenges within systems that have often served to perpetuate some of these challenges. So thank you, Abiola. I'm sure there will be a number of interesting follow-up questions for you. But first, let's hear from our keynote discussant, Franca Vaughan, a PhD candidate at Melbourne University. Over to you, Franca.
Thank you, Professor Shepherd. And thank you so much, Ms. Abiola, for your insightful lecture on the power of allyship and advocacy, and also your emphasis on the role that as allies we can play to make the world better than it is today, or make communities more fairer, and also make those who are less fortunate or those who are marginalized help some of these groups. I would like to say that your lecture demonstrates hope for the fight for social justice here in Australia and around the world. And it reflects the context of this conference, solidarity in diversity. And as one of the organizers, I would like to say that I am moved beyond words to hear you bring into words and to deliver this lecture in a way that is relatable, more so than I feel like we have done. So thank you so much for your words today. I feel like it has brought to life our thoughts and the anticipations that we had when we were putting the conference together, but in a more accessible way. So again, thank you. Now, I want to relate some of the things that you said to an earlier debate that we had on Monday, which was considering the motion, solidarity in diversity is a mirage, and trying to recollect some of the different arguments that was put forward, as well as the discussions that followed. You have confirmed in terms of what is going on, in terms of the role that allies can play or what they are doing currently. You have confirmed here that some of the issues that was raised then, that, and even my cynical self is belief or is being forced to believe that solidarity in diversity is not a mirage at all. It is a reality. Now, as you mentioned in the beginning of your lecture, in terms of all the different issues going on in the world with climate change and COVID and growing inequality, the Black Lives Matter movement and what it's trying to address, the various civic unrest, displacement, and all the different problems that the world is going through today, sometimes when you look at all those, it's much easier to hang on to the negativity and the doomsday scenario. But when you dig a little bit deeper, like you've led us to do today, you realize that there is hope, and it's around us today. You talked about how people are increasingly reflecting on the advantages that they possess that they may not have necessarily earned. And people are increasingly, myself included, questioning the power and privilege that we possess in our daily life. And as you've said, that is something, and that is something which we can be proud of. Now, I feel almost terrible having to move into a bit of trying to raise some questions that I would like your thought on, and your thought on, as well as the thought on and some of the people who are attending today. So for instance, you talked a lot about the Black Lives Movement and how important that has been for you personally. And not even just that, we have a lot of events going on, all preaching about solidarity and diversity. And what I've realized that usually what follows some of these events is a lot of well-meaning press releases and diversity statements, or trying to reaffirm our supposed commitment to public, our commitment or institutions' commitment to social justice. So you have that goes on quite a bit. We all agree that what is actually needed, and you mentioned that, is action-oriented plans and targets to actually cause change to happen. So I'm curious to know, and just to go back a little bit, for instance, yesterday we had Professor Julie Willis here, who came to talk about inclusion here at the University of Melbourne and the work the university is trying to do. And I was very moved by something she said. She said, instead of, normally the university expects marginalized groups or people who are different to change, to adapt to the university system. But what the university is trying to do now is to change to reflect these different groups. Now, I want to come back to you. I'm curious about the different leveraging tactics in these instances when following, let's say, for instance, the event of Black Lives Matter and how it's spread around the world, everybody showing their solidarity. How do we leverage such tactics to actually move from performative allyship, as you talked about quite extensively, to actually seeing change happen? So that's something that I really like your thought on, and whether in the spaces that you work, for example, if you've been able to, being on the University of Melbourne campus, there's been a lot of marches for refugees and different related marginalized groups. I'm wondering how institutions like yours or others, your thoughts on this, how they've been able to leverage some of these goodwill. Now, another issue that I'm quite curious about, and I'll love your thoughts on this, is then what they are calling the intersectionality of privilege. Even within marginalized groups, there are some who are more privileged than others, and I think you mentioned this a bit, but I want to relate back to a presentation that I think Dr. Mabifa made. And one of the things that he talked about was the factors that cause people to show solidarity. And one of the things he mentioned sort of sticked out, the different reasons why we show reasons. And within marginalized group, for example, using myself as an example, as a student, someone on a specific visa, my attitude and my actions in Australia here sometimes affect my visa status. And so I may want to show solidarity. I may want to go on the marches, but I am constantly afraid of being arrested by the police or being shown in a particular light that doesn't speak well for my residency here. That is something that I know a lot of people are constantly aware of. And I'm wondering your thoughts on this, if I can put it this way. And one thing that you mentioned that I find really quite interesting is your definition of allyship, and the fact that those of us who are supposed to be allies are supposed to provide support and not necessarily lead the agenda setting. We want the marginalized group to be able to set their own agenda and allies to provide the support. And what normally happens is sometimes some of these agenda setting issues get hijacked by the allies. And I want to relate it back to in the current culture of cancel culture, people are quite afraid to sort of express support, because you talked about people will make mistake and it's okay to make mistake. But we are in a world where sometimes when you make a mistake, there is no way for you to find yourself back. How do we in such a world express solidarity when sometimes you are not allowed to make a mistake. You make a mistake and you are cancelled. I would love your opinions on that. Now, one other thing that I want to raise finally before I hand over the mic to Dr. Shepherd is, or I hand over to you, is another discussions that we had yesterday, and we had different groups, African groups came to talk about the project that they are doing. And one of the main issues that they raised, which I thought was quite striking, is how territorial some marginalized groups can be. So there is no space to collaborate between groups. I'm curious as to why that is. I'm wondering whether you've encountered something like that and how you've dealt with it, either positively or otherwise, and the lessons and challenges from that. So again, I want to say thank you so much for making the time to share your thoughts with us this afternoon. I am most grateful, and I think I speak for the conference organizing team when I say we are very, very happy to have you here. Thank you. So I yield the mic back to you.
Yeah. Is it my time to talk?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. There's a lot in there, Franca. Thank you so much for your insightful reflections of all the topics that has been shared this week, including my lecture today. I would try and cover as much as I can. I've been taking notes, but apologies if I have not been able to address any one specifically. I think from the notion or the event of the Black Lives Matter, personally for me, I feel that that protest was very important to me as a person, as an individual, and also as an advocate. Being on that march and being able to walk the grounds with people around me really helped me and was a kind of an aha moment for me to really understand why I'm actually existing, why I have the platform I have, why I have the privilege I have, and what I'm doing about it. So it's kind of shifted my paradigm quite significantly. And I think for most people it has. But the challenge that the thing I want to address in that is we have people that have actually experienced racism. We have people that have experienced marginalization. We have people that are fighting for people that have experienced marginalization and trying to give them a voice. It's two different experiences, and that cannot be merged. And I think that's where it gets really difficult. You cannot speak for me as much as you believing that you've been through what I've been through. It's two different things. It's not something you can learn in an institution or as a qualification that you can have. It's a lived experience, something that's really ingrained in you. And also, I think that also brings that level of intolerance when you actually see that things have not been addressed or done in a way that fully represents you or represent your voice. So you're faced with a dilemma of finding purpose from pain that victims often go through or marginalized community often go through, with finding purpose in championing change. And there's always a tension there when those two communities come together. But I'm hoping that some context that I've given in my lecture today will be able to guide the way forward. In terms of intersectionality of privilege, I personally have experienced that myself in terms of how far I've come. I always tell people I feel like I'm on an elevator or an accelerator in terms of how quickly I've been able to maximize opportunities of this country, and I've been able to make something good out of it for myself, with God's help. But in saying that also, it's about using our experience to keep us grounded, keep us centered, and also using that to really build our knowledge around how we can help others to come out of that or become better in their own lives. I think my experience of seeking asylum has brought in me not only opportunities that I've enjoyed, but also helped me to understand what change looks like. And when I don't see that, sometimes I find it hard. There's not enough words to describe what is missing, but I just know something is missing. And that's only because I've experienced it myself. So that's something that we can understand when we are trying to work together with allies and the very people at the heart of the cause. Also, I think when it comes to leveraging tactics, we need to understand that since Black Lives Matter happened, there's been a lot of superficial statements. There's been a lot of well-meaning people that have come out and, you know, made all of these things. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. It's all winding down now. There's not a lot of attention being put on it anymore. But at the same time, I think we can actually become more intentional and substantial in our actions and work plans and orientations of our organizations, our communities, our place of work, wherever we find ourselves, if we actually know that Black Lives Matters. And I love what Chimamanda Adichie said in one of our interviews: all lives matter, but the very important topic here is that Black lives actually matter, and Black lives needs to matter for all lives to matter, if that makes sense. So I think it's really about being intentional and continue to raise those questions and continue to help every environment we find ourselves to bring that to life. Professionally, in my place of work, one of the things I've been doing, one, because I have the lived experience, is actually changes the way I include my voices in that space a bit differently and uniquely, I believe. But also one of the things I've been doing is to try and bring the organization into some level of reckoning. You know, we have said this is well-meaning, let's put it to action. And also I've been using my knowledge in that space to really guide what those actions look like and how we stay true to them, so it doesn't fall off in the midst of everything else. I hope I've been able to answer your questions or speak to your reflections in a tangible way.
Absolutely, you have. Thank you so much. I will give the mic back to Dr. Shepherd to facilitate the other questions and answers.
Great, thank you, Abiola, for those thoughtful responses, and also thank you for that excellent summary and series of questions, Franca. I might follow up with a few questions for you, Abiola, and then we'll throw to the audience for Q&A. And to the audience, feel free to post your comments in the Q&A box or raise your hand. I can already see some questions coming through. So just a few from me, Abiola. Have you sensed a generational shift? And this could be for African Australians or all other groups, I suppose more broadly, but have you sensed a generational shift in attitudes towards activism and advocacy in addressing inequality?
Oh, thank you. That's a very powerful question. I think when it comes to generational shift, where I've seen the most significant shift is that people are now actually talking about it. It's not a taboo topic anymore. It can actually be something that we all talk about. I think Black Lives Matter even gave us the more freedom to express those topics and make those uncomfortable discussions a bit more comfortable in our environment. That's the shift. But in terms of actually the inclusion of marginalized voices, the amplification of marginalized voices, one of the challenges we've had with that is really people not fully understanding what that means or how to apply it to their setting. I think it's giving us a dilemma where people are actually fighting for it, and most marginalized voices are actually demanding that their voices be heard, which most of the time actually creates a bit of internal tension. So you start fighting each other rather than fighting the cause. So that's the thing that I think hasn't shifted, and we have a lot of work to do in that space. It's actually been genuinely giving power back and redistributing power and creating spaces and opportunities for people to be their own change and be the force for the change where they want to see. I'm a mother of 4 beautiful daughters, 3 teenagers, and they come back every day. I don't think the identity has been as real to them as has been in the last 2 years, I would say, you know, in terms of them actually being an African, being a woman of color, you know, being all of that. It's actually becoming more prevalent. And for my daughters to be experiencing the things I'm experiencing doesn't give me a lot of great confidence, unfortunately, that things are changing.
Thank you. And just to follow up, how much do you think that genuine change requires breaking down long-standing cultural norms or traditions? And this could be from an African perspective or from a sort of an Anglo or Western lens.
Yeah, I think genuine change could happen. I think we need to go into it in a grassroots nature, and we actually need to start to look for quick wins and look for ways where we can have a structured agenda for change. where we are not only addressing where we get called upon, when we get challenged, when there's things that are not going wrong, then we'll fix this, then we have heard people, and then all of that. It has to be embedded in the organization. There has to be a framework for how that diversity and inclusion is being integrated. I think once we can do that, then we'll start to see the power shift, and we'll start to see spaces where people feel more included, feel more respected, feel more dignified, feel like their voices are being heard, and that ripple effect will happen in terms of policy reform over time. So I think we need to start from where we are at and develop and invest and develop in a framework that will help us to get there. Yeah, otherwise the long-term goal will always be a long-term goal rather than a practical outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to sort of follow up on comments Franca made, just in regards to social media, and you think you touched on this earlier. So it can be, social media can be a useful vehicle, obviously, for creating awareness. It's good for disseminating information and connecting like-minded people. But at the same time, I don't know if it can replace sort of, the good old-fashioned community work, rolling up the sleeves, doing the grassroots work, mobilizing people on the ground. And social media can also be a bit of a tense space that is sometimes conducive to emotive and performative criticism, which can quickly sever the capacity for a nuanced discussion. And Franca touched on this as well regarding sort of cancel culture, which appears to proliferate on social media. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the pros and cons of using social media for advocacy and activism?
Yeah, I think social media has been a very powerful tool and since it was invented and continues to be. I think very powerful tool in disseminating information, in building a movement, in creating allies, in providing immediate information out there, shining a spotlight on issues and all of that. It's been a very wonderful tool, but it's also been a damaging tool because a lot of people have hidden behind that social media to really stir up things that reinforces injustice and inequality in our society. So it's really about how social media is used rather than it being actually a productive tool. It certainly is a productive tool, but it's actually how it's being used. And I think another thing I would probably say as well is that no social media can replace human connection. So we have to see social media as an enabler rather than as the sole tool that we should be using. It's just one of them, and it's a very powerful enabler to seeing social change.
Thanks, Abiola. And just last one from me before we go to the audience. I just wanted to learn a little bit about you specifically. Can you tell us a little bit about your career trajectory and how did you end up working in the community sector? And was this something you had always wanted to do?
Oh, thank you. I probably will spend the whole day talking about that, but to give you a very snappy response to allow others to ask questions, I would say, sometimes life throws us what it throws us and we find ourselves in a situation. But from the context of my journey to Australia, I find my way into the community sector in Australia by accident. By accident, but I still believe it was meant to be. I was helping a family that has a child with special needs to do a fundraiser. And I organized all the fundraiser and everything, talking to people, and we needed a building for the fundraising event to occur. And they told me about a pastor that has a church. So I went to him, spoke to him passionately about what we're trying to raise, $40,000, how we're going to raise it, what we're planning, how we're going to use the space. I spent about 10 minutes or more just talking to him, really, just taking the whole communication at its best. And he looked to me and said, I'd like you to work for me. And I remember just being in shock. And I said, I can't work for you. I've never worked in not-for-profit in Australia. I don't even know what the regulations are, what the policies are, and all of that. But anyway, I started working for that organization, which is a crisis relief center. And very quickly, I progressed to a manager role. Very quickly, I realized my limitations, which get me back into education and building my skills and capabilities. And since then, I've just been taking advantage of opportunities that have been coming my way, but always ensuring that it aligns with my values and my interests.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks for that, Abiola. So we'll throw it open to the audience. So please post your questions to Abiola in the Q&A box and we'll read them out, or you can raise your hand and I'll come to you in a moment. Please keep the questions as short and as punchy as possible. So we've got a few in the Q&A box, Abiola. The first one's from Andre, and they write, when it comes to inclusion and allyship, whether for women or racial communities, it's usually the women themselves, the marginalized communities, or the victims who are aware of the problems. However, it's those with privilege, the upper middle class, the rich dads and uncles, the powerful politicians who refuse to understand. So what should be the strategy to get the message to them?
I think there's a lot of strategies, but I probably will talk about the ones that I've used, which is really building meaningful relationships. And building meaningful relationships means that you're letting people in, you're allowing to be vulnerable, you are opening yourself up for others to come into your life, come into your situation. Because if they don't see that, they probably would not be able to advocate for you as adequately as they should. You know, you can read something in paper, but you can also experience it by seeing other people go through it. So one of the things I've done is I've opened my house up, I've opened my heart, I've opened my, my situation out to people that I've really understood and going, you know what, if this is the change we want to see, we want to support you to achieve it. So I think unless we speak up, unless we ask for help, unless we allow our vulnerability to shine and actually bring us to this place of comfort by allowing other people to really come to our rescue and be the aid and support that we cannot get the right level of help. But I also know that from my experiences and conversations I've had with friends, family, people that we seek asylum together at the time, one of the challenges they've had that they've closed in that situation is because people have come to exploit them, exploit their knowledge, exploit their intelligence, undermine them unintentionally, and they just feel robbed. Feel robbed because they've been placed in an article, they've been placed in paper. Some people have even wrote books about other people's lives and making money off it. So those are the kind of situations that we need to be mindful of. If we want to actually get into people's lives and create a change, we need to understand that we're doing it for them and not for our own self-benefit.
Thank you. And we have a question as well from Mireille. Good to see you, Mimi. Mireille says, thank you for a brilliant presentation, Abiola. As an African woman from a refugee background, what are some of the barriers you face in working with allies to address institutional cultural dynamics that reinforce power relations and create additional barriers to participation to people seeking asylum and refugees?
Oh, that's a great question, Mimi. Good to see you online. Yeah, I think there's been so many, to be honest. I've only been in the refugee community or refugee organization now for 5 years, but it feels like a lifetime because it's not only, it's more than a job to me. It's just a calling. It's something that I'm very passionate about, always looking for opportunities that can enhance others' participation and independence as well. But I think the challenge I've faced the most, if I could put it in a context, with allies and advocates, is their lack of self-reflection, their lack of awareness, their lack of understanding of how they are in this empowering community they are very existing to empower, their lack of I call it travel inwards. There's no, people don't have that sense of emotional intelligence or ability to really check in with themselves and go, you know, what I'm doing, is it actually beneficial? Is it actually helping people? This is my intention, but does it add up? And also speaking to those communities directly to get that feedback. That's always been my challenge. And most of the time when feedbacks have been sought in an evaluation purposes and things, it's mainly to tick the box rather than to use that feedback as a tool to drive continuous improvement and imply an amplification of voices and inclusion. Yeah, so that's been my biggest challenge.
Thanks, Abiola, and thanks, Mimi. We'll go to Alicia, who's had their hand up for a while. Thanks for being patient, Alicia. Oh, no longer there. Okay. We go to the chat. We have a question from Ayan in the chat. does cancel culture even exist? Holding people in positions of power and privilege accountable isn't cancel culture. Do you have any thoughts on that comment or question, Abiola?
Yeah, it's a very sensitive one, and always very different depending on who you're talking to. But from the context of holding leaders accountable for their actions and inactions, I think it's still relevant, because the very nature of activism and solidarity requires that. It requires that accountability. It requires that people speaking up. It requires us to collectively demand change and see change. So whether you want to call it cancel culture, or you want to call it power dynamics or enforcing power, I believe that the role that we play in bringing leaders accountable for their actions and demanding a change in reform, a change in policy, a change in organizational attitudes to further embrace inclusion and diversity and put people that are very much at the heart of the issue in decision-making positions and platforms, and giving them the true freedom they need to be able to instigate change. I think it's very important.
Thank you. And we have a question from Charmaine. Good to see you, Charmaine. Charmaine says, or asks, love the concept of participant inclusive strategy for not-for-profits. In your experience, can you share examples of where it worked as well as the outcomes or impacts?
Yeah, there's been quite a few actually. I think an example I can give in terms of where those inclusion has worked is where organizations have looked at even the smaller things, because it's not a lot sometimes, is as look at what the smaller things in terms of even signage, even the layout of the organization, and how that can implicitly give a notion of power and exclusion, where they have really been conscious to that level of a granular level of going, it does our organizational structure and building and demarcation even allows people to feel included in this space, or to feel heard, or to feel like they own that space, those kind of things. Where I think also another thing I will talk about is around recruitment policy and how that has really enabled participation and inclusion. And one of the things you do in that space is really, or that I've done in that space, is to place value on the cultural and social capital that those communities are bringing in, and be able to use those values to determine, the outcome. Merit is always a very tough one when it comes to recruitment, but using that, I think using that at the access stage to give people an opportunity to be heard, an opportunity to put their hand up, an opportunity to express their willingness to step up, and then using the merit and in the process of determining who the suitable candidates are. And most of the time, those communities have really demonstrated beyond every doubt that they deserve to be in that space, and they deserve to be, and they have what it takes to deliver. But the challenge is for someone that has been in the community for 7-8 years, has done an executive role in their former country of origin, and then coming to Australia, working as an Uber driver and applying for an executive role, they probably wouldn't even get shortlisted. The very nature of our recruitment software will even delete their application before it gets heard. So it's really looking at those areas where inclusion are being threatened or not emphasized, and looking at ways that we can actually enable people to have that access is one of the things that I think it's been vital in terms of participation.
Some excellent questions so far. We've got a few more coming in. One from Kennedy, who says, very interesting presentation, Abiola. Could you perhaps share your reflections on how allyship has been changing or not? Is the coalition of allies broadening or shrinking?
I probably might not be able to speak from a global context, but from the environment and the courses that I align with, I think allies are growing. I was really impressed and very pleased to see the community response during COVID to communities that might be left behind, to see how people came out and really rallied around the African communities that were living in the tall building in the city of Melbourne during the COVID pandemic and the outbreak. And to many of that, so many people have not even had the opportunity to be seen as allies or to contribute meaningfully until those opportunities. But you see a community that's putting their hand up, that is interested genuinely, and the best of intentions is still out there. Is really the application where there's a gap. So I would say that allyship and solidarity is growing and the movement is building, but also the challenge has been the right level of application to get to the solution quicker, and not using the narrow privilege lens to determine what the outcome or the pathways look like.
Thank you. Have another question from Mimi. There are power structures at play when allies work to include diverse voices in advocacy, which can lead to tokenism. How can allies start shifting from getting only one voice in events or conferences and move towards meaningful participation of marginalized or disempowered voices, rather than viewing participation as a checkbox?
There's a lot of tick boxing happening, which can be very disheartening for the community and making them feel like, they don't want to even feel included because they know it's just tokenism. But one of the things I would probably like to refer to is Maya Angelou's quote that says, do your best until you know how to do better. But once you know how to do better, do better. I think as allies and activists, we need to understand what our best is, and then check in with the community if our best is actually enough, and how can we change that? I feel that most of the structures that have been built that has increased or amplified voices of marginalized community are still very much controlled by the allies and advocates, and they determine the longevity, the situation, the circumstances. So giving that full 360-degree level of ownership can be very challenging in this community or in this environment, based on processes, based on organizational structure, institutionalization, whatever context that you find it. So that can be very challenging. And looking at it based on the fact that it's not only the gesture that is good, giving someone a seat at the table, but making that seat sustainable for them and providing the level of resources and support to ensure that they always have not only this seat, but other seats on every other table. So like your question, I like your question, Mimi, in the sense that it's really addressed what's happening today, but also I think also we need to understand that the context and the environment that we're living very much bring that that paradigm I shared before around finding purpose through pain and finding purpose through champions of change. So it's going to bring that tension in where, advocates and allies still wants to preserve their level of control over situations because they're probably funding it, or they probably own the space, they probably own the topic, own the environment, own the platform and things like that. And they feel the sense of ownership and entitlement in that space. And that way they don't really understand that it goes beyond just giving someone a microphone, and there's so much more they can do because they've always held the microphone. So giving you the microphone is probably the best that they think they can do, and they can tick the box and feel that they've done enough. So it's about doing better and always making sure that we're checking in with our why.
Thank you, Abiola. We have another question. This one's from Kay. Thank you for sharing your stories and expertise, Abiola. What would you say are the best strategies and learnings for culturally diverse young people who are contributing to the agenda of social change making, especially working within not-for-profit programs?
I think they have a very key role to play, particularly young youths, young adults, and the like. And my advice to them is to always hold their heads up, always own their truths and share it. Never let someone's level of perception, assumption, conclusion of you determine the role that you play in allyship, advocacy, solidarity, and the like. I think youth brings a very, very unique lens to how we can see change, and they are the ones that challenges the status quo the most. So there's a very, very important role for them to play there, and they just have to do it with so much pride and be unapologetic about it.
Thank you. We have a question that was in the chat from Anita E. Thank you, Abiola, for an outstanding presentation. My view is that the real change we aspire to in Australia will not happen while our politics is still almost exclusively white, and our major corporations, even our universities, have almost no non-white people in positions at senior management or board levels. So long as politics and business is almost 100% white, various forms of racism and bigotry, such as Islamophobia, will persist. Even ostensibly positive measures can end up being tokenistic or patronising or misplaced. So the question is, do you agree that a substantial increase in Black people at senior levels in politics, business and academia is important? And if yes, what do you see as the best ways in which allies can assist towards achieving that objective to help bring substantially higher numbers of people into senior levels in our organisations?
Yeah, I think it's a very important one that you've reflected on, and it just reminds me of when I got this appointment at the ASRC, and the sense that I felt was a sense of gratitude, was a sense of this is a call to action, this is a platform for me to create change. I want to see 200 more Abiola on executive levels and not-for-profit, and even better, even higher. So that was my mission going in. But as soon as I got into the job, I started to have different reactions and different situations happening to me, not only in the organization, but even in the sector at large. People just congratulating me on the role and say, oh, it's about time, to have a Black person here. It's about time to have someone with lived experience. If you need any help, let me know. I'm here to help you. I'm here to support you. Like, it didn't even come with your own level of intelligence, or you don't deserve the role, or you don't have the level of merit. At first, I thought it was a very kind gesture until I started to reflect on it a bit more, and I started to feel quite uncomfortable, to the level that I had to go to HR and say, you know what, I want to know why I'm hired. Am I hired because of my color? Am I hired because of my lived experience, or I'm hired because of my intelligence? Because if you don't hire me because of my intelligence, I probably don't want to be part of this organization. So I'm just saying this because I want people to understand that when we say we want to see change and we want to see representation and inclusion, it has to be intentional. And if intentionality is coming in drops and it's too slow and the pace of change is not what we love to see, it's probably the best we can get now, because with time it will grow. And if we have people that have that sense of responsibility and duty to give others the same opportunity as they've had, they probably will make that happen once they get into those organizations. I think for me, tokenism is never the approach I would want. People say, let's do a quota, and once we do a quota, over time, things will have the population, and then we'll know what to do with them. As the populations are going in, they are exiting most organizations straight away because they don't feel included, they don't feel heard, they don't feel respected, they don't feel valued and genuinely welcomed in their role. They always seeing them as people with lived experience. They even refer them back as service recipients, that are now getting a role in the organization, commodifying them even in some cases. So what I would say to that is, we have come to the realization myself that until First Nation people actually have the level of recognition they deserve in this country, Black people will struggle to get that. Because if the very owners of the land are treated with little respect, with little reckoning, with not giving the right level of treaty and acknowledgement, I don't know how much we can push to see that change. But the role that we can do in this place is to be a contributor to really bring in that issue of First Nation recognition and acknowledgement into play, because once they have it, we have it. And we all can share it together as a community. And that's what I always come down to. So I would say in that, very briefly, that there's still a long way to go, whether it's in parliament, whether it's in politics, whether it's in corporate, there's still a long way to go. But for the ones that are even getting in, are exiting because they don't feel that they've put the right level of support around them, or even attitudes of the fellow staff to see them as valued contributors in the organization. So unless that is done and there's a clear framework and actions that genuinely counter racism and institutionalized practices that are really not enabling people to thrive, will always resort back to this very unpleasant situations where people that have the level of intelligence, capabilities and abilities are not given the position they fully deserve because of their color.
Thanks, Abiola, and some really good questions from the audience too. Another one from Charmaine. In the Australian context, migrant communities have moved from assimilation to inclusion, and recent sentiments have argued that inclusion has given rise to this performative allyship we've been speaking about. So the question is, should integration be what we need to be advocating for instead?
Yeah, I think integration is what we need. I agree 100%. I remember my daughter, she's 19 now, but when she was 17, she came back from school and she used the word assimilation in terms of how we are settling in this country. And I challenged her. I said, where did you get that word from? I'm not assimilating, I'm integrating. And she said, oh, that's what they just taught us today at school, you know, that migrants have to assimilate and have to adopt the new style and the new environment they're in. But if we do that, we'll lose a very, very big asset of social competence and social awareness and license, because we have not really embraced the diversity of thought, we've not embraced the diversity of culture, we've not enriched our society to the level that we need to. I think when it comes to integration, it means you can preserve what you're coming with, and you can actually utilize that to contribute to the rest of the community, and then embrace the community as well. And there's a flourishing that happens there. So my best word is integration.
Thank you. Another question. Thank you for your valuable insights, Abiola. I was wondering how important you consider semantics to be in such activism. For example, do you think terms such as allowing ourselves to be helped rescued can drive ultimately damaging white male savior narratives or circumstances, whereby the structures we are seeking to disrupt may actually be reinforced?
Yeah, I agree. 100%. I don't even need to answer that. I really agree. I really agree. I think when it comes to culture of saviorism, it's always put people at the mercy of others. It's a privilege to be an ally. It's a privilege to be an advocate. I'm always very uncomfortable when I'm in an organization that says, without us, people will sleep on the street. Without us, people will be homeless. Without us, you know, things like that. It's never my word. It's never something I support, because I believe people have resilience, they have agency, they have autonomy, they have courage. They actually want to live a better life. They just need your support, not your control. Yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you. A question from Stephanie. When you have been in a position to hold organizations or individuals accountable for racist actions and met with resistance and defensiveness from them, what are some of the ways that you have been able to progress that conversation, or even turn it into a significant or productive or tangible change?
Yeah, I think I haven't met a lot of resistance, and that's because of my own, you know, I've found I've been spending time developing myself as well in terms of what's the best approach, and it's actually maintaining curiosity and being objective about the very issue, because emotions will not get you anywhere. The only thing emotions lead to is defense. So one of the things I've been doing is to be very objective in the things I'm raising, maintaining level of curiosity of myself and others, asking the right questions, challenging assumptions in a very respectful but very clear way that helps people to really recognize if they've done wrong or where we need to get to, and also including them in the solution, rather than me coming with my own understanding of what the solution is, or including them and helping to guide that discussion to lead to the outcome that we need. I think for us, if we have victims or we have lived experience, it's always very hard to separate ourselves from the issue, because it's like you're talking about me. This is my experience, and I'm feeling very hurt or upset by what you're saying. So it's really about making sure that we are very aware of that ourselves and checking in with that, because all what that leads to is just the sense of defensiveness and people not taking accountability or taking responsibility for their actions, but making sure that we are using that platform and that environment to raise the right level of questions and interrogations that challenges people's assumptions. And also find people within the organization or allies that can help to be of support to you as well, so you're not on that journey by yourself.
Great. We'll go over to Gloria, who has had their hand up. Gloria, go ahead.
So I just thank you so much for your presentation. It's giving me so much hope.
Thank you.
But this question of inclusion and integration that is come about, I think it's really important that we unpack, because integration, as we know it, is bringing smaller parts of things together. When those smaller parts already have established and have a bit of respect and so forth. So at the moment, with the way in which racism is in this country, when we look at non-Indigenous netballers standing down just in the last few days because of racism they were experiencing in their own team. So when we talk about Black Africans like us being able to be included, and we jump straight away from inclusion into integration, I think we could miss a really important opportunity, and we will miss actually starting anyway. And so I don't view inclusion as performative or tokenistic. I actually view it as a very important step. Inclusion is also the fundamental in psychological safety. So if you look at the process of what psychological safety is, inclusion is the first element. And so if we start preaching integration when we haven't actually sampled what inclusion is, which is also fundamental for any safety relationship, we could miss the boat. And I just thought I'll make that comment, because inclusion is still fundamentally important for our relationship here as Black refugees and Africans, and that we should really look into that concept very well. Yesterday, Stephen Ho spoke about inclusion, and I think we shouldn't override it and then create another word, integration, when we haven't actually really unpacked what inclusion means. And it also depends, like you said, it needs to be intentional. And so if it's done properly, inclusion is actually a very positive thing. So I just wanted to say that.
Oh, thank you, Gloria. Thank you. That's a very powerful point. I think in the previous question, we were addressing the better word, whether it's assimilation or integration. We were not intended to ignore the role of inclusion. The role of inclusion is fundamentally important and will continue to be important. I think where the context of that question was really around, are we expecting people to assimilate or to integrate? So that's just to clarify, that was the point, but I really unpacking inclusion and unpacking integration, and also understanding the intersections and the stages at which each of them applies to people's sense of feeling settled, feeling included, feeling like they can contribute socially and economically. It's really important. Yeah.
Thanks, Abiola, and thanks, Gloria, for that question. We have another question from Mimi. As a student at the beginning of her PhD who wants to create knowledge that contributes to empowering women voices with lived experience of forced migration, what do you think is the role of academia in shaping advocacy? And what are some of the urgent actions we can work on?
Wow, that's powerful. I think the role of academia in shaping advocacy is to actually help the community at large to understand what needs to be done, what change needs to be happen. But to do so, like I said in my lecture, from the place of trauma, but from the place of positive contribution and the potentials that this community could contribute to our society. I think that's just my caveat to that. But I feel that academia could actually help to bring some really tangible, practical ways of us and enhancing our skills and knowledge as advocates and allies in order to best be the best force for change that we can be in situations that we our interest or our passion aligns with.
Thank you. We have another question. Do outsiders, so for example, white people who are trying to be allies that are working with communities of color, do they have a role to support people who may be experiencing oppression within that marginalized group? So for example, on the basis of gender or age, for example.
That's been always a tension, and it's something that I've been coming across quite regularly recently, to be honest, in terms of people actually sensing an internal cultural oppression and feeling that what role would they play in there to alleviate that and to bring people to account. But my one advice would be that we should always see ourselves as a support to those community rather than as the ones that would point fingers. So if we see any injustice happening within a community and it's affecting people we know, our role is to give them the level of information that they need to be able to make an informed decision rather than making those decisions for them and feeling like we're responsible now to police what's happening in those ethnic communities and bring people to account. And this is Australia, this is how things needs to be done. This is not permitted, law is against this and all of that. It's culture is really, really complex. So don't let us get ourselves entangled in that. Our role is to provide information, provide support, and provide guidance for those people to be well informed and make informed decisions about how they want to address their own issues.
Thank you, Abiola. Another question in the Q&A box. Thank you for all your wisdom. I am interested in your experiences of dealing with discrimination and abuse of power from people within the activist community. So when the person is hierarchically in a higher position than you and not even necessarily a white person, what would be your strategy? Do you have any tips on risk assessment here before speaking up?
That's it's not something I've really thought of. But just speaking to it now, what I would do in that situation is to make sure that our governance is fine-tuned and all those issues that are being raised are being addressed in there. And if they're not, I'll probably be wanting that to be in there so that we can start bringing people to account. I think self-gratification and identity, identifying with a brand can often consume our leaders and help them to not always be checking in and trying to take the center stages. So it can be very challenging even for that leader to know when they have crossed the line or when they have taken over from the actual cause that they are trying to protect. So if it's someone that we have a very good relationship with, they probably would appreciate that feedback in an objective and constructive way. And if not, if it's something that is happening repeatedly across multiple individuals, I probably will encourage that we address that from a governance point of view and ensure that some mitigations have been built into our risk management to ensure that when those complaints start coming in, we have the right process in place to address it.
Thank you, Abiola. We've got a question from the raised hand. Actually, Dr. Tebejay, go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Abiola, for such a fantastic address. I really enjoyed that. This is not a question, actually. Just a brief comment on inclusion and integration. Both Gloria and Abiola, they are correct in that integration is yes, what we all need is inclusion, but what should be the principle of inclusion or the rule of inclusion? If you see societies which are not multicultural, like see Nordic countries, for example, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, you are expected to assimilate. That is the principle of inclusion. As a refugee, you need to learn the language, you need to act the way they act. The only thing they don't change is your color. then see multicultural societies like Canada, Australia. The principle of inclusion is integration. What that means is that you have the right to maintain your values, cultural traditions, and all those things. And at the same time, you can claim an equal right to participate in the society. So I think within the multicultural political project, the principle of inclusion is integration. And we need to, we should, the point would be, is it perfect? Is it serving minority groups like us well? That we can argue, that we can challenge, and we can work together for an improvement. But as a minority group, what we need from society like Australia is obviously a principle of inclusion, which is integration. That enables us to maintain our own cultural values and practices, but also claim equal right to participate in society. So the 2 points are really, the 2 concepts are really, they can go hand in hand without any contradiction. That's the point I want to make. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Tebijay. Abiola, would you like to, any thoughts in response? No. Okay, great. I think we've only got a few minutes left, so I think we have time for one more session. Sorry, one more question, I should say. Abiola, what are your thoughts on culturally diverse emerging researchers being conflicted between investigating socially disadvantaged people's stories to create change and empowerment, whilst at the same time, having to capitalize from the stories to advance their professional career due to the nature of the system? Very good question.
Very good question. I recognize that tension, because you don't want to do that or get people's stories for your own advantage, which sometimes might be that you're completing your thesis or getting recognized as a PhD and things like that. So it can be a bit of a dilemma. But one of the things that I would probably say is in all of that is to make sure that you have equipped yourself or build your knowledge around trauma-informed practice and also around cultural intelligence, so that way we will have done it in a way that preserves people's dignity, preserves their sense of being, and also gives you the right level of consent and endorsement to utilize their information for your own advantage.
Okay, thanks, Abiola. I think that's all the questions we have. There was quite a few, so thanks for responding. Oh, we got one more question? No? Okay, wonderful. We might leave it there. So thank you again to our wonderful speaker, Abiola Ajetomobi. Impressive body of work, very inspiring, and congratulations to you for all the good work you're doing in the community. You're making not just the African Australian community proud, but also the broader Australian community. So keep up the good work. And thank you to our discussant, Franca Vaughan, and the conference committee as well. And thank you to our audience for attending and for your participation. So take care and enjoy the rest of the conference. I think JP is going to conclude with some final words. Thank you.